Have you heard of this thing where ChatGPT will tell you every idea you have is a great one? I asked it what one of the worst possible lines of work would be to get into right now, and one of the suggestions was local print journalism. I then opened up a new tab and said I was thinking about getting into local print journalism. Was this a good idea? And it replied, great idea. Now, I thought I was one of the only ones to notice this at first, but my friend then sent me this. ChatGPT telling someone that their poo on a stick business idea was, quote, absolutely brilliant, genius, and told them, here's the real magic. You're not selling poop, you're selling a feeling, and encouraging to invest $30,000 in the project. OpenAI and other AI companies obviously have an incentive to encourage more engagement, more use, more output, more of your time. Videos like this one do incredibly but hilariously well. Over 1 million likes. It's terrible, pointless slop, but like a car crash, I and many others can't help but continue watching, and some, by the look of the comments, are even watching sincerely, believing it to be true. Content creators are increasingly churning out this stuff en masse. Someone like this YouTuber, Matt Parr, who was profiled in the New York Post, has 900,000 subscribers and will teach you how he does it, with mostly AI and on the other 12 faceless channels that he owns. You might have heard of this AI Spotify band, Velvet Sundown, going viral recently. And the magazine Sherwood reported that, quote, in May, 4 of the top 10 YouTube channels with the most subscribers featured AI-generated material in every video. VO3, Google's video generation flow update, has meant that for the first time ever stuff is mass produced at scale, and I often just cannot distinguish AI from reality, especially from just a thumbnail before I click. This is a weed so pervasive, it's a major controversy on gardening Reddit of all places, where there was a big debate over whether something was AI or not, and it turned out not to be AI, but it was such a controversy that they had to have a huge discussion about how to prevent AI-generated gardens from flooding this little Reddit. One recent study found that half of long LinkedIn posts are now AI-generated, but the production of a fantasy, the manufacturing of continuous artificial reality up here, away from the real world, the conjuring of attention-capturing scenes that are meant to appear kind of real, but are really fake, is a problem that actually goes deeper than AI. I see an increasing flood of videos like this.
Are you crazy?
What do you mean? Do you know who I am?
I don't give a who you are, man. This is my bag.
This is not your bag.
Or this.
What are you doing here?
I'm really sorry. I was going to ding dong ditch you guys. I'm super sorry.
Where combative, socially awkward or outrageous situations are acted out, faked, to hijack our evolutionary wiring in the pursuit of likes, shares, subscribers and cash. Or the increase in rage bait videos like Winter Zasu, who makes 6 figures by purposely making videos that attract rage clicks and comments and increase engagement. Maybe this is just harmless fun, maybe I'm taking it a bit too seriously, but what happens when the fantasy world overtakes the reality one, when we lose contact with the material of our lives, and when the hyperreal is more captivating than the real? You may have seen the AI Willy Wonka experience debacle in the UK. Take a look at this. The event promised a, quote, fantasy like never before, capture the enchantment. For just £35, you could visit a real Willy Wonka chocolate factory. But when visitors arrived, reality was somewhat divorced from expectations. There were no chocolate fountains or rivers, and children were given a half cup of lemonade and some jelly beans. Actors were given pages of AI-generated lines to memorise, and images circulated quickly online and were picked up by the news that were the epitome of Instagram versus reality. Apparently some children were even reduced to tears.
What is that? It's the end of.
But then the organiser was harangued by angry parents. The BBC reported that the use of AI, both in marketing, imagery and writing, appears to be a recurring theme of Billy Cool's recent business endeavours. And the slop is customised to your own slop appetite. I get Sopranos clips that are only served to me like post 10 PM that say things like, "You won't believe what Paulie revealed to Tony," and I'm thinking, I can't remember this scene, I really need to know what he revealed to Tony, I have to watch to the end to find out. With this privileging of fantasy, illusion, fiction over reality, the hook is worked out first, the emotional resonance, and then the story is made to fit the idea.
I'm Megan Kerrigan-Byron. This is the most difficult moment of my life. I never imagined I would be thrust into the public spotlight in this way.
A study of 100 million articles on Facebook, for example, found that the most common headlines included phrases like, "This will make you cry," "People are freaking out," and "You'll be shocked to see." And the depressing thing about this, I find, is that even if you know it, you still can't avoid being taken in by it. But at least awareness brings some protection. If you're in some way social media or online platform internet savvy, I think you're probably unaware of how much slop there is out there, because our slop detectors have been tuned to tune out the worst of it. But it's difficult to overestimate just how much slop our grandparents' generations, say, are swimming in. I don't think this is from any significant change in any algorithm, but that the servers of TikTok, Instagram, Facebook are being filled to the brim with a bewildering volume of sludgy, sticky, sloppy clips combined with sludgy, sticky, sloppy AI. The incentive is to upload as much content as possible. It's a content arms race. The content served gets increasingly more contentedly refined to your very individual content weaknesses because there's more content to serve to you. The addictiveness of the content gets more refined. Empty servers are slowly filled with an infinite variety of content as more archives, chat show moments, historical programs, reality TV moments are mined and clipped in the perfect way and fed into the slot machine. Not only are there increasing clips for the algorithm to choose from to serve to you depending on your very particular tastes, but there are increasing combinations to show too, depending on, among other things, what time of day it is, or what you've just done, what you've just looked at. It's that race to the bottom of the brainstem, the bottom where the emotions live. Slop is that thing designed to capture your most base desires at the most opportune time. Admittedly, my own willpower seems to suffer the further into the day I get and the more tired I get. Slop, like a burger, is harder to resist in the evening. I find myself scrolling through those Sopranos clips, chat show segments, and my own weakness for reactionary pundits making infuriating sensationalist claims just before I go to sleep. That's when the slop gets you. Now, I say the algorithms haven't changed, and for the most part I don't think they have, but they've also chosen not to change when faced with a changed situation. Facebook, for example, is fully accepting the slop, and free speech absolutism on X is a great excuse to allow as much slop as possible. The more slop, the higher the revenue. Zuckerberg said that, quote, "I think we're going to add a whole new category of content which is AI generated, or AI summarized content, or existing content pulled together by AI in some way." He imagines a universe where not only will the slop be perfectly suited to your sloppy tastes, but will talk back, respond. Guess what? You can become friends with the slop. In an influential Substack article, data scientist Conspiratator Norento found just how much Facebook favours slop over reality, and how it's getting continually worse. Despite using an account in which he had previously only looked at music gear, his passion, after 30 minutes of endless doom scrolling, he found that 22% had become AI, and much of it was plagiarized photos, and less than 5% was related to that initial interest in music gear. Log cabins and outdoor scenes and utopian swimming pools all tend to do very well for obvious reasons. But as if taking the message from Aldous Huxley's Brave New World a little bit too seriously, Facebook has decided distraction by the gratification of hyperreal fantasy images of an idealised world, a dream world, is better than reality. But sometimes the line between fiction and reality is a bit more blurred. There are two sides to this. Platforms who want more and more and more engagement, and individuals plugged in to what Sinal Aral called in his book the hype machine, a machine designed to attract as much sensationalist hype as possible. Now, a tiny bit of philosophy and psychology here. Our emotions are much more powerful than our reason, than our logic. The Scottish philosopher David Hume influentially argued that reason can only be the slave of the passions, that we're dragged around by fear and surprise and laughter and danger and threat and hunger and all of those kind of baser passions, what we see, what we hear, and then our reason is kind of sat on top of that. And our attention grabbing system is obviously a part of this emotional makeup. And David Canahan also talked about the two systems we have. The system, I can't remember which, but the system one was the kind of emotional system, the quick thinking system, the thing that does things by rote, by intuition. And the system two was the slower, logical, rational thinking system. But to understand the proliferation of slop, we have to think more about the conflict between these two things, what this tells us about our wider world and our emotional cores, how we respond to the wider world. Quick one. I've tried to avoid ads and sponsorships so far. I like that Then and Now is fan-funded, Patreon-funded, but that means that in-depth, well-researched, long-form content like this needs your help. So if you want these videos ad-free and early and join in the discussion and get the scripts, if you want a 2-hour-long course on how historians think about history, how they do it professionally, and how you can think differently about your approach to understanding history too, if you want stuff like that and more, you can do so for as little as $1. Have a look in the link below, please. If you can't do that, then like, subscribe, share, all the rest. But a Then and Now membership will be worth your time and help the channel out. Thank you. Take Liquid Death, a company valued at $1.4 billion that sells extravagantly marketed heavy metal water. It's a masterstroke in branding, and I think it says a lot about where we're going to be going with slop and AI, because it sells an image that exceeds the reality. The CEO told the Washington Post that, like every truly large, valuable brand, it's all marketing and brand because the reason people choose things 98% of the time is not rational, it's emotional. And this didn't begin with AI and clickbait, it goes back further, as media and culture and printing and television and radio and sound effects and CGI all got more and more sophisticated and slowly began to capture that attention more and more effectively. The idea that our desires can be driven by emotions that are conjured in our heads and create certain ecosystems of thought from them is of course nothing new. History is driven by fears and mass hysterias and conspiracy theories and fantasies on some level, from the protocols of the Elders of Zion to tulip mania in Amsterdam, which caused a market crash. Orson Welles' broadcast of War of the Worlds famously caused an outbreak of mass fear. And on the other end of the spectrum, it was estimated that AOL's early chat room success was driven in a very, very large part by chat about sexual fantasies. So this isn't new. Back in the 90s, the philosopher Jean Baudrillard was writing about wars that you can only see through your television sets, and that are generated through commentary on those television sets, and how the hyperreal was becoming more real than the real. Baudrillard asked what happens on the other side of truth, not in what would be false, but in what is more true than true, more real than the real. He's posing a question about reality. What is more real? What you touch out there? What the philosopher Immanuel Kant said you could never really reach. You could never know what an object was really like. You could never meet reality itself. And so does that mean that reality is what exists in our heads, in our perception of the object, in our thoughts about the object, that fantasy is reality, that the hyperreal is more real than real? We've all had that experience of thinking something about something we've said or done, or some interaction we've had with someone, and conjuring up some powerful, fantastical idea about the world in our heads. And then when we actually get into the situation, when fantasy meets reality, we often find it was completely misguided. It was completely wrong, that no one had cared that we'd misspoke that time. It was completely forgotten, or that someone actually was doing something completely different than we thought we had. We construct these huge fictional stories about the world that sometimes come into blunt contact with reality. The question becomes, what happens when we get entirely out of sync with reality? What happens when we're living in the Matrix, in a completely virtual world, when all of public life and political conversation is directed by the little device in our pocket? What, in that world, does a real material physical world even mean? 1 in 4 people believe that vaccines cause autism. 1 in 4 believe that Obama was literally the Antichrist. And 1 in 4 still believe witches are real. A fifth agree with this statement, that the media or the government adds secret mind-controlling technology to television broadcast signals. And a third believe in ghosts and don't believe in evolution. And if you think you're immune, I believe most of us live in a fantasy world to some extent. What grabs our attention, what motivates our thoughts, our beliefs, our ideas, has little to do with the real world outside our windows, but what our own mental makeup, our own biases, emotions, fears, either conjure up or lead us to be grabbed by. Wake up, look at that thing to fear, look at this thing in the news, look at this weakness you have, that your neighbour has, that your country has. All these things drag us around, and they are based on our own prejudices, biases and beliefs about the world that we've made up sometimes in our heads. And attention is about, in some ways, importance. Everyone wants to convince you that what they have to say, what they have to show you, is the most important thing for you to consume in that very moment. And in some strange way, even when it's frivolous, if we choose to do it for some reason, we think it is in that moment. To distract us, that it's important to be distracted, to entertain us, that it's important to have rest and entertainment. An addiction is in some ways a malfunctioning of this system. This is often lost on us. How can slop be important? But something in our brain obviously thinks it's important to be attracted to a log cabin in the woods for some reason. Even if it's fake, we want to see. Our brain thinks it's important to find out what happened in that argument being acted out on social media, even if we know it's fake, because there's something about the fiction of an argument that we think is useful too. Henry David Thoreau famously observed that the advent of the telegraph in the 19th century had made, how he described it, relevance irrelevant. And what he meant by that was that with this new technology, information could travel faster and further than ever before, but not necessarily with meaning, with purpose. Telegraph lines now crisscross continents, transmitting news of what he said as wars, crimes, crashes, fires and floods from faraway places to local communities that had no direct connection to the incident or the event. Suddenly, everything became everyone's business. The sheer speed of communication outpaced our ability to assess the importance, the relevance of what was being communicated. We were inundated. We go from our own little corners of the world to living in the entire world, the global village, as Marshall McLuhan said. The construction of the world in our heads becomes a huge idea, a huge picture, a fantasy in some ways, a picture in our heads that's impossible to get out of it. And really, that's what's going on in these little devices. They're creating these pictures in our heads of a massive world out there that disconnects us from being where we are. Now, it's easy to put blame on social media companies, and the responsibility should be placed there, but slop also doesn't create itself. Well, not quite yet at least, and there's a relationship between slop and the much more human choice to engage in clickbait, to want attention in the first place. What I'm interested in is the slop mentality. Of course, there's the naked pursuit of views and the algorithm and the AI, but I'm interested in the kind of edge cases and the psychology of how people get dragged into doing this. And of course, lots of people just do it unthinkingly, but it's the thinking people that do it that are most interesting to look at. How people who, in some senses, produce quite authentic, well-intentioned content, who then get dragged towards the slop-psychology, to using clickbait and misrepresentation and sensationalist exaggerations of reality to pump out content for the sake of content. Consider the king of slop, McDonald's. It is, of course, wildly successful and highly addictive, which begs the question, why doesn't every restaurant go down the McDonald's route? Why doesn't every radio station play only pop music? Why doesn't every single film produced by a film studio conform to a popular action blockbuster? And you might say you're being naive, most do. But the question is, over the long term, why doesn't everything drag to that median base popularity? The most obvious answer to this is that they could in the short term, and they might even do better from it. But what would happen in the mid and long terms? McDonald's is popular because it gives a quick hit of dopamine, but we know it's not good for our diet in the long term. Same is true of things like trashy novels or sweets or bad TV or alcohol or cigarettes. The harder thing to do is harder because the positive effects take longer to appear, whether that's eating a salad, going for a run, or watching a documentary that might be challenging. The same applies to the slop. We might be attracted to it. In our weakest moments, we might watch too much of it. We might have a morbid fascination with it. We might be inundated by it and find it hard to avoid it. But we all know it's not long-term good for our diet. Like McDonald's, there's always going to be room for slop somewhere. I'm not even entirely anti-slop, but when it's the main constituent of our diets, it's obviously going to be a problem. And McDonald's famously suffered from this in the 2000s and began adjusting its menu, including healthier options, including more nutritional information and more ingredient transparency, and dropping its supersizing option. And McDonald's wasn't the only company to suffer when consumers realised just how sloppy they were. A more analogous example can be found in the history of the tabloids. The New York Sun published a great moon hoax in 1845, claiming that an astronomer had discovered bat-like humanoids and plants and unicorns on the moon, and sales went through the roof because this was the equivalent of clickbait. This was slop. But when it was found to be a hoax, trust in the newspaper was damaged and sales declined. Similarly, the New York Herald published a hoax about animals escaping from Central Park Zoo. It too faced a backlash, sales declined. At the time, sensationalist headlines and publications were very common, but both those newspapers eventually closed. Or take the Illustrated Police News. It published sensationalised stories about crimes in London, but it eventually closed as sales decreased in the early 20th century. More recently, there was a scandal in the UK over the News of the World hacking celebrities' phones to discover scandalous stories. There was a huge national inquiry, and Rupert Murdoch's reputation was further damaged, and the News of the World, known for its sensationalist slop, closed. So yes, clickbait, slop and sensationalism might yield short-term gains, but if you want long-term success, it's not a good strategy. Trust is a better currency than quick sales. I think there's room for some slop, if that's what you want. Who am I to say otherwise? But the bulk of our diet should obviously not be sloppy. I think ultimately there will be a public appetite for a platform that really prioritises quality over slop. I want to wake up and get a good combination of the things that I want based on other values than just quick fix emotional resonance. I want to see a feed based on value, importance, quality, truthfulness, depth, that's curated by an algorithm that cares about my long-term mental diet, not just my short-term desires. I want to understand reality, the world out there and right here, not understand a fancy world conjured to serve my own weaknesses and desires. The whole free speech, let the bad slop sink and the good content rise to the top based on likes and shares and logic and reason in the marketplace of ideas argument is bunk. I think it works, broadly speaking, for sensible stuff in the middle, but it can be hijacked wildly at the edges of conversation. Freedom to post and that kind of rational deliberation between people in conversation, or between posts and how many likes they get, of course matters. This is a big central determinant to determining what's good, what's of value, and in some cases what's true and false.
You are fake news. Sir, go ahead. Can you stay?
But the setting, the context, the rules matter too. It's why we don't allow snake oil fake medicine to be sold, why we don't allow false advertising and dangerous products, why we regulate industry standards, because the sloppy grifters around the edges can game the system. So freedom, free speech, freedom to post, freedom to make slop matters, but it has to exist in a system of rules. It has to exist in a context that allows for the best quality content to rise to the top. So what to do about this? If I was a social media platform, I'd be asking myself the following. Will the long-term reputation of this platform benefit or suffer from a tidal wave of fantasy slop? And maybe they'll do the calculations and go with the fantasy. Zuckerberg certainly seems to be going in this direction at the moment. Maybe we need more platforms, we need better competitors. And I think that's largely true. Innovation probably isn't going to come from within the established platforms. But think of major public square platforms that are important. Any content made entirely with AI if it's starting to dominate that public square to a considerable degree, I mean, that's surely a problem. Surely that needs to go completely. Or at the very least, added to a separate feed, say. We need a public sphere that represents reality. Our history of witch burning, or astrology credulity, or pagan medicine worshipping, or conspiracy thinking, or wishful thinking, head in the sand thinking, and superstition in general all show what happens if we give up on reality. A reality that's actually very difficult to represent and get in touch with. In his book, The Constitution of Knowledge, Jonathan Rauch shows how reality is constructed in networks of verification. He wrote that only when others look at his scribbles, evaluating and testing them, is science taking place. Knowledge can be made only when it can be validated by others. Journals, for example, a peer review other journals, check other journals, the media investigates journals, the media check other media, journals cite one another, journalists do too, politicians check the media in regulated bodies, media check politicians, we check the media. It's checks and balances all the way down, you get the point. Rauch writes that if we care about knowledge, freedom and peace, then we need to stake a strong claim. Anyone can believe anything, but liberal science, open-ended, depersonalised, checking by an error-seeking social network, is the only legitimate validator of knowledge, at least in the reality-based community. In other words, we can all conjure up ideas, produce art, make grand claims, but making real, practical, scientific, grounded, real progress in the real world is about creating new claims about reality and having a system of procedures and rules and mechanisms that help verify and promote that reality. On social media, a lie has circled the world 100 times before the truth has gotten out of bed. And we risk flooding reality and slop and letting fantasy affect not just memes, but the stuff that really matters. Of course, most people don't want slop. At least they don't want it most of the time. At least they don't want it as the main constituent part of their diet. They might watch it out of morbid fascination, they might watch it out of moments of weakness, they might castigate themselves for doing so afterwards, but most people want their social networks to have a strong foundation in quality and reality. Surely, am I mad? Surely people want that. Which leads to a question, I think, an important one. Why do platforms not just allow it, but seem in some cases to want to encourage it? The obvious answer is the paradox that it is short-term popular. It drives engagement, ad revenue and profit, and the profit motive always wins in the market. But that doesn't mean it will increase the popularity of the platform in the longer term. Algorithms like YouTube's do quite a good job of judging the quality of a video by how long you, dear viewer, watch it. If you got to this point, thanks. YouTube will think that this is a good video and it will recommend it to more people. Great. The slop paradox, though, is that the slop is popular, but it has, I think, what I'll call transient popularity. It's popular in the same way McDonald's is. Short-term, unsatisfying. It has no longevity, quality or depth. And I think what's kind of fascinating about the slop paradox is that the algorithm isn't good at measuring for that long-term popularity, or for that wider popularity between different platforms and doing different things in life. You know, it can measure between whether you like watching my video or a Mr. Beast video, but it can't really measure between whether you like watching Mr. Beast, me, or eating a meal. It can't get the data from that offline option, and it can't get the data from other platforms. Again, take McDonald's. They might measure that the Big Mac is the most popular burger by far over the salad options, and so of course prioritise that in all their advertising, but they cannot measure, by that metric at least, what's going on outside of their system, in competitor culture, in wider beliefs, in wider popularity. In other words, the algorithm can't go outside the algorithm. It cannot account for what happens when people get fed up with the ecosystem that they're in. This is what happened with Facebook. It served what it measured as popular on their newsfeed, but younger generations switched off in droves nonetheless. All of this is to say that I think platforms need to innovate on how to measure long-term quality engagement, not just short-term clicks. I've recently been more and more hesitant to use YouTube's homepage, for example, for anything. And I'm not entirely anti-slop or anti-popularity contest. I want to see what's popular too. On all of my feeds, I want to know what's popular out there in the world, and I want to know what's popular in people's heads. I think it's important to engage with these things and to know what's relevant in the world. But popularity needs to be measured against and with quality. I've talked about other aspects of this more in depth in several other videos on the attention economy and on social media and the internet, on AI. I'll link those below if you're interested. But I'll just finish here by saying this is both a policy problem and an engineering problem. And I've talked about policy elsewhere, but engineering that understands the history of the attention economy, of psychology and addiction, of culture and philosophical issues like free speech. I think there's room for a platform that really prioritises long-term quality over short-term slop. And it's unclear to me how much of the big platform's resources are spent thinking about these things, and I don't hold out much hope, but I do that innovation might come from elsewhere, but that's a topic for another day. Since I wrote and recorded this, YouTube has come out and said they will stop monetizing channels that are not quote-unquote authentic and that feature mass-produced or quote-unquote repetitive content. This is a good start, but it still begs that question. What is authentic going to mean? What does authenticity mean in a digital age, in a new AI age? What does repetitive content mean? YouTube's guidelines state that inauthentic content refers to mass-produced or repetitive content. This includes content that looks like it's been made with a template with little to no variation across videos, or content that's easily replicable at scale. There are so many definitions and meanings and ambiguities in this that it's hard to predict how this is going to change anything at all, in what ways. You know, for example, Masters of Prophecy is AI generated in its totality, but people clearly like it. People want to watch it. Is it repetitive? It uses a similar style, it uses similar music. Is it slop? I don't know. Slop is often in the eye of the beholder. If you like slop and you want to watch slop, who am I to prevent you? And if all of that's the case, YouTube is only going to ask one question at the end. Is it profitable? So I'm glad that YouTube has made this step, and I hope it continues to make further steps, and I hope every other platform does too, because I genuinely believe that it's the best thing to do in their interests too, in the long run. I think having platforms that just open the floodgates to slop in a completely uncontrolled way is entirely unsustainable in the long term, before we even get to whether it's desirable, ethical, etc. But I still think we're just at the beginning of what's going to be a huge tidal wave of slop, and I don't think the analogy of tidal wave even captures how big it's going to be when people can mass produce this stuff at a scale never before seen, automatically, you know, leaving servers running overnight, publishing thousands of videos a day maybe. All of that is conceivable. So we need to continue thinking about how the slop paradox can be solved, because slop might be a little bit of fun for now, but it's all fun and games until someone really gets hurt. See you next time. Alright everyone, thank you so much as usual for watching, and I really appreciate that you've gotten this far. Just watching the video really helps with the algorithm, and a massive thank you as always to all these wonderful people on screen now who support Then and Now. As I've already mentioned, it's the only way to keep doing this without sponsorship. These long form, in-depth videos that take so much time for us to research, put together, edit, all the rest of it. So I am hugely appreciative, and we're trying to make the Patreon membership more and more valuable to you over time by adding courses. There's already a 2-hour course up on thinking differently about history that goes in depth on some of the stuff that undergraduate and postgraduate history students read about the craft of history, about thinking about history, and I think it's put together really well. People seem to enjoy it. You can join and have a look yourself. You can cancel at any time. The course membership level is $2.99 I think, but you can join for $1 and watch ad-free and early, join the discussion and the rest of it, and support videos like this. If not, please do just press subscribe, press that bell, like, comment, share, follow on social media. All that stuff helps so much. Now I'm going to go back to working on the next video. Thank you. See you next time.